Hello and welcome tonight. My name is Catherine Zichelli Sullivan, and I'm the seedling sale coordinator with the Worcester County Conservation District. Tonight's webinar is on lawns and lawn alternatives. I wanted to tell you our webinar tonight is funded with a grant from DCR's Working Forest Initiative, and the Worcester County Conservation District, along with our partner North County Land Trust, received this grant for a webinar series. And we also want to tell you about some conservation assistance that's available for individuals. If you're interested in learning more about conservation restrictions or in land restrictions for your own property, you can reach out to the North County Land Trust. Tonight, Jassy Bratko is here. Wave, Jassy, maybe your screen will come up. She's going to provide some contact info, and you can see it on this slide here at the bottom. If you'd like more information about conservation on your land for restrictions or an easement and how to protect your land for the next generation, you can reach out to her. They have a mission area, which is Northern Worcester County, showed on that slide. If you're not in those areas, you can still reach out to us. You can reach out to Joel or myself, and we'll help you get started as well. We also want to let you know about other conservation assistance through the Worcester County Conservation District. We provide technical assistance related to soil testing, invasive species, starting your own rain garden or a pollinator garden, or other resource concerns you might have on your land, or if you have animals, if you have some farming on your land and you'd like some conservation help. We have Joel Betts, who's on our staff as our conservationist. There, he's waving to us. He's also our Zoom guru, helping us through tonight. So you can please contact him for a phone conversation or to set up a site visit for your property. Okay, I'm going to go on to administrative details for tonight. Please mute yourselves during the presentation. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat button below. Gretel will let us know when she's ready to respond to questions. If you really want to talk, please use the raise your hand button. And also, the session that we'll have today is approved for continuing education credits for forestry. If you're a licensed forester or you work in that field, stay online or email us and we can get you continuing education credits. Okay, so now the reason you're all here, I'd like to really welcome Gretel. She is a Massachusetts master gardener, and she's going to talk with us about our lawns and alternatives. Thank you. Do you want to get Greta's?
Yep, she's going to get that up right now.
Awesome.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm going to start. Sometimes people have to leave before the end of a presentation, so let me point this out to begin with. A great deal of the information from tonight's talk comes from these fabulous sources. The UMass has this best management practices for lawn and landscape turf. It's about 65 pages. It will tell you everything you need to know to have a healthy lawn. There is also the Mass NRC, which stands for something resource. Catherine?
I'm not sure what that stands for.
In any case.
Natural Resource College? Is it
council something, but natural resources for sure. And it's going to tell you if you choose to attack your lawn with something more than human power, what the trade-offs are and what the considerations are, and also thresholds. Whenever you see the word IPM, which stands for Integrated Pest Management, it tends to be a very rational, very data and fact-based approach toward managing things in the natural world. And then University of Maryland and Cornell will help us out with pests and weeds. Lawns are a just marvelous thing. If you ask anybody, such as the people from the Journal of Environmental Quality, they will tell you that they're good for mental health, physical health, community pride, protect things, noise abatement. It's just fabulous. Bear in mind that this, when they're writing, to a large extent, they're talking about turf as opposed to pavement. So turf is cooler than pavement. Turf is quieter than pavement. Turf, well, is not actually better for soil loss and erosion control than pavement. But we have all of these published benefits of turf. There are actually drawbacks of turf. All depends on your perspective. It is completely inedible, and it usually offers nothing to the animals around us except for an occasional rabbit who may enjoy grazing on it. It is, in fact, the biggest irrigated crop in the US by a factor of 3, primarily with drinking water. So as we grow more and more concerned with the availability of potable water, we're still pouring it on our grounds. 70 million pounds of pesticides. Isn't that awesome? Mowers and blowers are loud as all get out. It does reduce greenhouse gases more than pavement, but clearly less than a forest would. It is a boring habitat for pollinators if there are no flowers in it. And given the pesticides in it, it is downright hostile. It's expensive. It will drive you nuts. It may hurt you, 76,000 mowing accidents. So, and ornamentally, it's kind of a good backdrop, but you don't stare at the lawn. You stare at how nice the flower bed or the house looks on the other side of the lawn. So there's some people who are still dead set on this gorgeous, gorgeous lawn, but we're also beginning to learn and think about compromising. One of the first things you need to ask yourself is, what do you want from your lawn? And for the people like some of my friends who say, I have to do it this way or my neighbors will lynch me, how much say are you actually going to give them in how you conduct your life? How does it really need to be all grass? Does it really need to be green all summer? And how much time and energy and all of that are you willing to invest in it? The lawn on the left is, I will admit, gorgeous. It probably is on a golf course or some kind of a playing field. It is probably 90% bluegrass, and it's pretty clear nobody has walked on it since the mower last went over it. The one in the middle is mostly grass. It shows some wear spots from the tires driving over it, and it's a lot cheaper and a lot less toxic than the one on the right, and then the one on the left. And then the one on the right is basically a mowed flat area, and anything that can live in a mowed flat area is allowed to live. I will tell you how to do all 3 of those lawns. It is up to you to decide which one or another option you actually want to do. The outline of this talk is to start by evaluating and fixing your site, and we'll stop for questions after that. Then I'll talk about replanting and supplementing and renovating, but also what you could consider putting in your lawn besides just grass, and routine maintenance. So I'll give you 15 seconds as I jabber on to look at this picture and think about what challenges this lawn has. Well, it looks like it's in fairly moderate shade, and most lawn grasses don't like shade. They like sun. It is up against an asphalt road, and they get very, very hot. And sometimes around the edges, the soil is shallow, depending upon how they prepared the road. That may be part of why you can see the grass being white along the edge of the asphalt. In addition, we tend to use a lot of road salts, and they get piled onto the edge of the lawn in winter, and then in spring tend to hurt the growth of the lawn. Because there are trees, there's not only shade, but there are tree roots which suck up, well, anyway, compete a lot for the moisture that the lawn also need. It looks as if they put in enough mulch spots that they don't actually walk on the lawn, which would be another hazard or challenge that the lawn has. While I'm looking at this picture, let me mention that the mulch job that they did on the tree on the left is a horrible thing to do to the tree. You should not pile mulch on top of tree bark. Where the tree flares as it hits the soil, that should be open to the air. We have a tendency to pile mulch up because someone told us to add 4 inches of mulch every year, so it just accumulates. Don't do that. It's bad for the tree. Make it flat. Don't make it a volcano. So site assessment, the biggest thing, the most important thing you can do to grow any kind of plant anywhere outside is to get a soil test. These are acorn squash. They were planted as seeds by the same person on the same day at the same depth out of the same seed packet and treated the same. And lest we think one of them is a mutant, there's a whole long line of giant green acorn squash that way and a whole long line of puny yellow acorn squash that way. I look at the soil, I can't tell the difference. I even look at the grass, at the weeds growing there, and I don't see a difference. And I couldn't tell the difference until I got the soil tested. The difference is pH, which is a measure of the acidity, alkalinity of the soil. But the important part is it's an indication of how well the plants can intake nutrients. It's not a nutrient itself, but at the right pH, plants have access to the nutrients in the soil. And if the pH gets too high or too low, it doesn't have as good access. What happened is, this is my vegetable garden. One of my many mistakes. We carved out a 50 by 100 foot patch in an old field. We got a soil test. We added the nutrients, the manure, the lime, the whole thing, and we farmed for a year. And then the second year, we grabbed the next 50 by 100 foot patch, added a bunch of manure and nutrients, but didn't add the lime. So where you see that big green acorn squash, the pH is 6.3, and where you see the yellow one, the pH is 5.5. That's all it took. So get a soil test. You can get it from UMass. You can get it from University of Connecticut. There, the last time I looked, it was $12. You can get it from University of Maine. I'm told that that one's 18. Just get a soil test. And by the way, the ones that you get, the pH little solutions that you get at box stores are not accurate. So don't do that. Go get a real soil test from calibrated equipment. Then look at the light while you're waiting for that to come back. Lawns like full sun. If you have kind of a mowed flat space, 4 hours of direct sun will work. If you have one of those house beautiful cover lawns, you're talking about 6 hours of direct sun. That means sun in the middle of the day. It doesn't mean 3 hours first thing in the morning and 3 hours in the evening. It is blazing midday, doctor tells you not to go out in it, sun. That's what grass likes. Look at sun and shade patterns. Remember that this is the wrong time of year. The grass isn't really growing now. My front yard is full shade now, it will be full sun in midsummer. There's a line of white pines to my south, and right now the sun is just beginning to come up over them. But through most of winter, it never got that high. So my lawn was shady, my field was shady. It's going to be full sun in summer, so look higher than the sun is now. But also be conscious if you're looking at bare tree branches that those are going to be filled with leaves and may cast a lot of sun. Remember or look to see if your lawn looks sparse or mossy, though that can be caused by issues with the soil. You can buy a tool called a sun calc that will measure the hours of sunlight, but it will measure the hours of sunlight right on this little disc, on this little stick. So if you put that right next to a bush, like on the north side of a bush, it'll tell you you're in full shade. So if you're planting moss, which is down where you have the sun calc, that's the right answer. But if you're planting a sunflower, which is going to be above this low growing shrub almost immediately, maybe put the sun calc up on a stick if you're going to plant something taller. If your sunlight is marginal, select grasses or other plants that tolerate shade. There are grasses that will grow in 4 hours of direct sun that will grow okay in dappled sunlight through the day. They're not going to be great, but they'll do okay. If the sunlight is completely not there, then consider not having a grass lawn there, or make more light. You can cut down trees. You can also limb up trees. Sometimes as trees grow, they will get wider and taller every year. And often if you cut off one row of lower limbs, you're bringing in a lot more sunlight. The lower limbs are going to be the longest. They have to reach the furthest to get to the sun. There's a trick if you really desperately need a grass lawn, which is basically to reseed the lawn every spring and use annual grass seed. Annuals are desperate to get their life done. They got 1 year to do it. So if you reseed your lawn every spring, it will come in green and full and rich, and of course die come fall, at which point you have to do it again. But that's an option. It's a high energy option, but it's an option. Lawns like evenly moist soil. We do not get even rain in New England. We probably don't get that anywhere. 1 inch of water per week is the ideal, and 1 inch of water a week does not mean 1/7 of an inch of water a day. It really does mean 1 inch a week. What you want to do is completely moisten the root zone where you want the roots to be. So if you only water a little bit every day, you're only going to moisten the very surface of the soil, and all of the roots are going to be in there. And then if you miss a day or it gets especially hot, the plants suffer. If you get that whole area moistened, the roots are going to fill that area and the plant is going to be so much more robust. Somehow we think of lawns as not really plants. They're something else, but they actually are just a whole bunch of plants. How much water it actually needs depends a little bit on everything else going on. If there are trees there competing for the water, if you're growing bluegrass instead of fescue, you may need more water. And of course, if it's blisteringly hot and windy on top of that, it will need more water because the ground will dry out so much faster. But again, if you focus on moistening the whole root zone, then even if it's hot and windy, it's not going to affect the ground 6 inches down nearly as much as it does the surface. It's useful to know what your soil texture is, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and how compact it is. Lawns are things that we like walking on, and because of that, they tend to compact. Look around to see if there are any particularly dry spots or wet spots. One builder trick is to cut down a tree and leave the cut stump about an inch below the surface of the ground, which means that every summer you're going to have this yellow disc of desiccated grass growing right under over the stump, because it doesn't have that deep root space. So look out and see, is there one area that just always goes bad? It might be really sandy, but it may also be really shallow because there's something buried there. Wet spots are worth looking for too, and hot spots are worth looking for. There's less that you can do with them other than just compromise and say, maybe I'll put a border of something in there because it's always going to be really hot there. If your soil is compacted, run over it with a coring aerator. And I think, yeah, I'm going to talk about soil compaction in a minute, and I'll talk about what a coring aerator is then. You can smooth deep pockets by throwing down compost. You can actually put compost down on your lawn pretty much any time, as long as it's shallow enough for the plants to peek through. But if you have a particularly deep spot, you might want to throw more than a handful of compost in there. Again, if the roots are coming, if the green part is coming up through it, the roots will grow up to it and the plant will rise. Adding compost, I just talked about. Tilling is really tough because it means starting over on your lawn. Drainage, if the soil is too wet, and that means at least digging a trench. And once again, considering alternatives. So there are a bunch of ways of doing soil texture. You can dig a hole and fill it with water and see how long it takes to drain. You can grab a handful of soil and squeeze it tight. And if when you open your hand, it just falls apart, it's sand. If you poke it and it still doesn't fall apart, it's clay. And otherwise it's loam, which is somewhere in between. The more scientific method is this, and it's still something you can do at home. The real scientific method is to ask a scientist, but this will work for now. You take a straight-sided clear jar with a tight-fitting lid. You half fill it with representative soil. You fill the rest with water. You screw on the lid really tightly, and then you shake it very hard to the point where all of the soil is suspended in the water. You put it back down on the ground and wait 10 minutes, and then draw a line on the side of the jar showing how much stuff has settled out. Those are the really big particles. That's the sand. You come back after 2 hours and you mark how much has settled out. That's the silt. You come back after a day, mark how much has settled out. That's the clay, the really tiny particles. And there may still be stuff floating, and that's the humus, some of the organic matter. Then you go find a sixth grader, if you haven't done math in a very long time, and figure out what the percentages are in terms of height of those lines. In this particular case, the silt, which is the medium-sized particles, are 40% of the volume. Clay is 10% and sand is 50%. Then you go to this weird triangular chart and go to the point on it that's 50% sand, 10% clay, and 40% silt, and you find out that this particular soil is characterized as loam. The reason why people don't do this more is partly because there's math involved, but partly because the solution, regardless of what your texture is going to be the same, which is to add compost. If you have very sandy soil, the problem is that water can only cling where the sand touches the sand pieces touch each other, and they don't touch each other that much. Therefore, water runs through very quickly, and so do dissolved nutrients. compost fills in some of the gaps between these giant sand particles and gives more places for water to stick. So the soil becomes more absorptive and nutrients don't go out as fast. The problem with clay is that all of the gaps between particles are so tiny that they just fill completely with water and there's no air spaces, which the plants also need. Compost makes clay clump up, and that causes there to be air spaces, which lets soil drain better. So pretty much regardless of what your soil texture is, adding compost is going to help it, which is why in the end, we don't care what our soil texture is, we just add compost. Nutrients and toxins. Lawns like rich, fluffy soil on the order of pH 6.5 to 7. And again, that's the acidity of the soil, and that's a measure of how well the plants can absorb nutrients. Some have been told by their grandparents that they are supposed to add lime every year. What adding lime does is increase the soil pH, but you don't want to increase it past 7. And in fact, 6.5 is actually healthier. So even if you have been adding lime, maybe especially if you've been adding lime every year, you should get your soil tested. You may have pushed it past where it's healthy. Good soil for lawns only needs about 2 to 4% organic matter. That seems like so little, but that's enough. And that's something that we can easily provide with an occasional dusting of compost. One of the things the soil test is going to tell you, should tell you, is whether you have lead in the soil. If you have lead in the soil, you need to be very careful, particularly about young growing people being exposed to the soil. Plants are pretty much lousy at absorbing lead. So the problem isn't the lead that might creep into your lawn. It's going to be tiny. The problem is the actual dust. So if a toddler goes out and plays trucks or fairy princesses in the yard and comes back with dust on their hands and gobbles down a snack before washing them, they may be ingesting lead. You should find that out by getting your soil tested and find out if there is lead there. One of the solutions, if there is some lead there, is actually to make your soil even healthier, because that tends to bind the lead more tightly into the soil, makes it less available for us to ingest. Another thing to do if there is more lead in the soil is to make sure that whatever plants are growing on it are growing thickly enough that you will not and your people will not be particularly exposed to the soil. And that might be a really thick lawn. It might be putting mulch on top of the soil, but it's something that you should know. To my knowledge, there are no regulations requiring soil to be lead tested before it is moved around in this state. So even if you're in a brand new development, not an old farmhouse where you would suspect that the lead paint has trickled into the soil, even if it's a brand new development, you may have lead in your soil because they may have scraped it up from around old housing. Get it tested. The more common issues that we have are salts and dogs. If you have lawn growing near a pavement that got salted, when the ground thaws, try to put down about 2 inches of water over a 2 to 4 hour period. Slower if you need to. You don't want the water to run off, because if it runs off, it's just going to be carrying the salt somewhere else to someone else's property or some other part of your lawn. What you wanted to do is dissolve the salts and push them down below the root zone of the plants where they don't have a problem desiccating the plant. The way a plant absorbs moisture is by increasing the density of salt actually inside the root. And since moisture flows in order to balance out concentrations of solute, it goes from the less salty place in the soil to the saltier place in the roots. And that's part of how water gets into the roots. But if the ground is really salty, it's going to end up sucking the moisture out of the plant instead of allowing the plant to absorb it. That's the problem. So get that salt away from your plant roots. If your soil is, again, way off 6.5 to 7, it will be less tolerant of salt, and you can use a calcium lime. If you need to change your soil's calcium without changing its pH, you can use gypsum instead. And gypsum is also good for breaking up clay. If dog uses your lawn, if it's your dog, train the dog to go to the edge of the lawn, because wherever the dog pees, you're going to get a perfect example of over-fertilization, actually. You're going to get a dark green circle where the grass got lots and lots of nitrogen, but a tolerable amount. And then you're going to get a little white dead spot in the middle where the plant got too much nitrogen to tolerate and died, or at least got its blades killed off. If you don't like that, you end up walking around behind the dog with a watering can, and wherever the dog pees, you throw on some water to try again and dilute the nitrogen and distribute it better in the root system. Soils, well, all plants like fluffy soils. There are some very unhappy trees in Boston Garden because 1,000 people a day walk all over their roots, and you can tell they're suffering because the soil is compact. An ideal soil is about half solids, a quarter air, and a quarter water. So when you walk all over the soil, you are removing that pore, you're squeezing out that pore space, and that decreases the plant's ability to absorb dissolved nutrients. It needs both the air and the water there. So this time of year, your ground should be pretty darn fluffy. We haven't been walking on it. It should feel spongy when you walk on it, which means we also probably shouldn't walk on it. But if May comes around and you try to stick something in the lawn or into your flower bed and it just doesn't go in, your ground is compacted and it could use fluffing. If you have a small area, if it's a bed, you can fix it by hand. If it's a huge lawn, you might want to fix it with a machine. In either case, what you're really after is a core aerator. There are two kinds of aerators, core aerators and spike aerators. A spike aerator, and this, by the way, this is giant machines or silly little things that you strap onto your feet or hold in your hand. Same deal, core or spike. A spike aerator just has this solid spike or a bunch of them. When you stick it into the ground, it does break the surface of the ground, which will let stuff in. But what it's doing is compacting the soil around that hole in order to let that spike in. And when you pull out the spike, within a fairly short period of time, that hole is going to be gone. The ground is going to re-expand to fill that space. What a core aerator does is actually remove soil. Think of sticking an apple corer in the ground and pulling out that cylinder of soil and just putting it on the surface of the ground. You have broken the surface of the soil so things can get in, but you've also removed some soil so the ground around it can expand out into that area and get more pore structure in it. There are core aerators, which are machines that you run across your lawn and it does things. There are little ones that you strap to your feet, or if you're having a really bad day, you can go out with an apple corer and just start hacking at the ground. The cops may wonder, but just say you heard it here. It's fine. One of the things people who think about their lawns really worry about is thatch. And I think most people don't actually know what it is. It's undecayed plant material above the mineral soil. If you look down at the ground and you see 3 dead leaves and then soil, you do not have a thatch problem. That's fine. That's normal. If you cut a wedge of the soil out, like is shown in the picture, and you compress that spongy layer of material between the soil and the plant, and it's more than ½ an inch thick, then you have a thatch problem. You have a really thick layer of undecayed stuff. There are things you can do about that. Core aeration is going to help because it's going to break it up. You can consider dethatching. Long term, if you lower the pH to 6.5, because this usually happens when it's higher than that, the microbial activity in the soil will ramp up somewhat, and it will dissolve that or decay that stuff quicker. Reducing fertilization will reduce the rate at which you're generating that stuff. And mowing more frequently may help. It depends on what your rate of mowing is now. Sometimes this happens because the grass is mowed sort of once a month, and then all of this material is just matted down rather than mowed based on how it's growing. So I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. I'll remind you that if the questions you have are about what kind of plant, what kind of grass should I use, that's coming up next. Or how do I plant the lawn, that's coming up next. But if it's anything about preparing the site, I'll be happy to answer that now.
Gretel, we did have one question come into the chat box, and the question is about salts. The question is, would a heavy spring rain help to dissipate salt instead of the long watering that you recommended?
A heavy spring rain after the ground is thawed is a marvelous way of dissolving the salts. If it's one of these all-day rains where we get a nice solid inch or two of rain, that'll help a lot. Do understand that what feels like a heavy rain to us may not feel like a heavy rain to the plants. So if you're planning on using the upcoming storm to fix the salt problem, throw a bucket outside and see how much water you actually collect. And if you get a couple of inches, you're done. But if it rains all day and you get ½ an inch, you probably need to add more. We tend to judge it by the misery index rather than actual rain down. Any other questions?
Yes, we have a question. Does mowed grass make for good compost?
Yes, but mowed grass, so ideal compost is half green, half brown, ballpark. Brown means stuff rich in carbon, and it usually also means fairly dry stuff. Green means stuff rich in nitrogen, and confusingly enough, green stuff may be not green. It may not be the colored green. It might be coffee grounds, wet coffee grounds, but it's rich in nitrogen. Fresh grass clippings are very rich in nitrogen, but if you fill a whole hamper with fresh grass clippings, what will happen is it will compact so much that it will decay anaerobically, and it will turn to this interesting slime, and it will stink. That's not, it's still going to make soil. It's just not going to do it the way you want. So in an ideal world, what I would recommend is if you still have leaves or anything like that left over, mix it in with the grass clippings, or do a layer like that of grass clippings and then a layer of something dry. Alternatively, since that's now not how nature provides us stuff, spread the grass clippings out and let them dry out a little bit. They don't have to be bone dry, but they shouldn't be really, really sopping, and then throw them in the compost heap.
Great. That's an awesome answer.
Or actually throw them under your plants. They also make really nice mulch. But again, I'd let it dry out a bit or it tends to mat together.
Oh, we have a lot of questions coming in. Question about soil testing. Will a soil test indicate lead content?
The 3 that I have just told you about will indicate lead content in parts per million. Moreover, the site will give you guidance as to what parts per million is acceptable. Because don't expect to see 0. Don't worry if there's a little bit in there.
Yeah, usually those tests will say like what's an acceptable level and what is too high when you
Right.
get them as well. Another question about soil testing is about how many, in a large area, how many soil tests you should take.
So if you look out at your area and it all looks the same, it's all equally lush, regardless of what you're growing, that's one soil test. If you look out and you see that part looks lush and green and that part looks kind of puny, that's 2 soil tests. Within a soil test, you need to sample the soil from at least 6 different spots in the area to make sure that what you're getting is average soil for that area. But how you divide your yard up in terms of how many actual soil tests you need is gut feel visually.
Thank you.
The follow-up question is, how often do you need to get your soil tested? If when you get your soil tested, it comes back and it says, boy, you need to change a lot, then do what it says and get your soil tested in another year. If when you get your soil tested, it says, you're just about right, then you don't need to get your soil tested for another 3 to 5 years, unless you plan on growing something different. Understand that the soil test will always tell you to add nitrogen, because nitrogen is so fleeting in the soil. When I say just about right, I mean pH, potassium, and phosphorus.
Okay, we have a couple more. I have tree roots close to the surface. Should I not use a corer? Any alternatives?
So stuff happens to roots all the time. If what you have is a giant oak, for example, with a few massive roots leading out into the lawn, I would try to avoid those roots, but I would probably still use a corer. If what you're concerned about are the tiny little feeder roots, those get cut all the time. So I would go ahead anyway. The corer is only going to go into the soil about that far. So it's only going to damage stuff that you're probably fairly familiar with already, stuff near the surface.
Okay, do you want to take 2 more before we move on to the next
Sure.
topic? Let's see, I have a steep lawn area. How might your suggestions be different on a steep lawn?
So the main thing that I would do on a steep lawn area with what we have already discussed, which is not what plant material, is I would consider sending in, depending upon how large the area is, send in 2 soil tests, one for the top and one for the bottom, because a lot of nutrients do move downhill. Secondly, in terms of watering, I would probably attempt to water more slowly to make sure that the ground really had a chance to absorb the moisture rather than having it all run to the bottom of the hill. You'll have a sense on whether what you're doing is adequately accommodating that hill. If everything at the bottom looks so much greener than everything at the top, and the soil is equally deep, then odds are the nutrients and the water have been running down and going slower would be a good thing.
The last question we have here is, what about a mulching mower rather than collecting the clippings for a compost heap?
Grand idea. Mulching mower is a beautiful thing to do. The intent is you chop everything up really finely and leave it there. When you think about nature, what happens in nature is there are plants of whatever size. In fall or occasionally, a bunch of organic matter falls off of the plants onto the ground, and it rots in place and returns those nutrients to the soil to be made available to those plants and others. When we have a lawn and we remove the clippings, we're subverting that concept. We are not allowing that extra plant material to return to the soil. And that's why we then say, well, I guess I need to fertilize. If you do the mulching mower instead, you may not need to fertilize much at all because it's a lot more of a closed system. You may still need to fertilize a little because frankly, those plants wouldn't be growing quite that densely if they had much say in the matter, but that's a different matter. But they do look nice like that. Okay, let's go on. We'll have time for more questions later. I'm going to talk about how do you fix your lawn, which includes the mechanics of it, but also what plants you might consider using. All the turf grass in Massachusetts is imported from Europe. Native grasses are clumpy. European grasses, at least the ones used as turf grasses, are more running, and they make this more or less even lawn. It's also, and they're English while we're at it, and England has cooler weather, or used to. So these are cool season grasses. They grow really well when the soil temperature is less than 80, less than 70 maybe even. So they have a growth spurt in spring, and then they have another one in fall. And in the middle of summer, they actually, left to their own devices in a dry summer, they'd go dormant. That's a survival characteristic because after that big flush of growth in spring, there's a possibility of an increase in predators, of things that doubled their population too because they had all this beautiful grass to eat. If the food supply crashes in the middle of summer, the predators will either also crash or move on. So then in fall, they can come back and get some more growing done. Based on this picture, the best time to seed and to fertilize is the beginning of fall. If we seed at the beginning of fall, we have 9 months before the seeds, the little plants we've just started, have any serious competition from weeds. If we fertilize at the beginning of fall, the plants that are growing most heartily are the ones we care about. They have the best shot of absorbing the nutrition that we've added to the soil. If we fertilize at the beginning of spring, there's a good chance that a lot of the nutrition will be absorbed by the plants we care about. But if we then fertilize again at the beginning of summer, unless we're planning on doing a lot of watering to mitigate the hot weather, we're basically fertilizing the weeds because the plants, our lawn grasses have already stopped growing much. They've slowed way down and they're not eating very much. And if you start your seeds at the beginning of June, you're going to have a fight the entire summer to give them a chance to grow against all of the weed seeds that are so much better suited for that environment. The way you patch a lawn is you rough up the bare spot and incorporate any amendments that you need to, including potentially a starter fertilizer. But if your soil is really pretty good, you don't need to do that. You spread the correct seed at the rate recommended on the package. When you look at the back of a package of grass seed, there will probably be a picture of how densely the seed should go down. And it's kind of like seeds on a bun. It's not dense, not like poppy seeds on a bun, though they pack those on, more like the sesame seed model. You want space between the seeds. Each one of them is going to turn into its own individual plant, and it needs the space to do that. So do it by the instructions. You firm down the seed to make sure there's good seed soil contact. You don't cover them because they need light to germinate well. You water to again improve the contact and also start the seeds germinating. You consider mulching with a bit of hay, just a few wisps of hay to help keep the soil moist and keep the birds off, because grass seed tastes good. And you keep watering possibly once a day, once or twice a day, until the seed germinates. And then you keep watering, but you do it less often, and you focus on getting that whole root zone moist to make sure that the roots extend to fill it. When the baby grass is about a third taller than the surrounding grass, it has anchored itself well enough that you can mow it. And consider adding follow-up fertilizer at the time. Don't put down broadleaf killer. Even though this is not a broadleaf, the baby grass just isn't that tough. If you have basically the whole lawn is thin, improve the soil to the extent you can without ripping it all up. And that may mean broadcasting compost, using a core aerator, dethatching, but only if thatch is a problem. There's a machine called a cedar slicer. It has a hamper of seed that you throw in there, and it cuts slits in the soil about an inch apart and tucks the seed in there. So it's a great way of going over an existing lawn and basically doing the whole rough up the soil, put the seed down, make good soil seed contact without having to do it manually. After that, you do the same thing as before. If there's a big patch, you mulch it, you water daily until the stuff is well up, then water less often to make sure it really gets established. Mow when it gets tall enough, and don't apply broadleaf killer for a good long time. If you're going to start over, and this includes even if you're not planning on planting grass seed, you need to prepare a good seed bed. And that generally means tilling the whole thing up, pulling out the clumps, pulling out any rocks, mixing in, if the soil looks particularly sandy or clayey, mixing in extra amendments. Settle the soil with a roller, half filled with water, so when you walk on it, you don't leave deep footprints. Then you scratch it up again. You spread the seed. You tamp it down to have good soil seed contact. I've done this 3 times. It is not fun. I will never do it again, but it works. And then you do the same thing as before. There are 2 alternatives if you're growing grass to putting down the dry seed. One is this pre-germinated seed sprayed on with paper pulp, usually in some bilious green color. It's easier, it's faster, because the grass is already pre-germinated. They've cooked it, not cooked it, but kept it warm and wet for a couple of days before they spray it on. So it comes up really quickly, and it's got mulch built in. The downside is you may not be able to select which seed you get because it's whatever's in the tank, but you might be able to. And then the third option is sod, or these rolls of turf that you roll out, you tamp down to make sure that there's really good root soil contact, and you take care of it just like it was a baby seed at the beginning, because you really need to get those roots out of that thin layer of sod down into the soil. You need to water it every day, except now you need to water it every day deeply. Every day, because its exposure to the world is so small, but deeply to make sure that it extends down into there. The amount of prep you need to do on the soil is the same for all of these. If you put sod down on a badly prepared seed bed, it isn't going to take well, and you'll just have to start over. If you're going to grow grass, pick the grass based on what you want it to look like, how much maintenance you want it to do, and how much sun you have. The beautiful lawns are mostly bluegrass. They grow in full sun. They require lots of maintenance. They require easily half again more water than the other ones, but it's mostly bluegrass. In full sun, less maintenance is mostly fine fescues. In shade is fine fescues and perennial ryegrasses and pretty much no bluegrass. In a perfect world, you would want multiple cultivars of each. A cultivar is a cultivated variety. So Kentucky bluegrass is a species. And then the breeders have made 25 different Kentucky bluegrasses. They have subtly different colors, but they also have subtly different disease resistance, water needs, sunlight needs, nutritional preferences, none of which is exactly documented. But the idea is that if you were to plant all 25 of those, the ones that did well would end up filling in for the ones that didn't do so well. So the bigger variety you have, the more likely it is that you're going to find something that really, really likes your site. More cultivars is always a better thing. Here is a bag of typical seed. This isn't a very good bag, mind you. It has 30% program perennial ryegrass. Program is a cultivar name. Perennial ryegrass is perennial ryegrass. Kelly Kentucky bluegrass is a Kelly is a cultivar name. Ken Blue is a cultivar name. Boreal creeping red fescue and Gulf annual ryegrass. So they throw annual ryegrass in there so it greens up really fast. But the annual ryegrass is going to die at the end of the summer, leaving little holes in your lawn. They may not, I mean, not actual holes, but space. So you don't want a whole lot of annual ryegrass of annual anything in there, unless you're planning on replanting every year. When I look at this seed mix, it's sort of neither here nor there. It's a third, it's about a third bluegrass, which isn't enough for a high maintenance, gorgeous looking lawn, but is kind of too much for a low maintenance lawn. Doesn't look like a great mix to me. The last time I started from scratch, I ended up grabbing one box of sun and shade and a box of playground and a box of conservation mix. And they all had different, particularly bluegrassy, because I'm not in, it was sun and shade and it was low maintenance. And going that way, I probably had 10 different cultivars and a reasonable mix. So do shop around a little bit and actually read the label. You can also consider not going with grass or not going with 100% grass. Clover is a wonderful addition to a grass lawn. The standard clover, which grows wild here, is green through the summer. It's got tap roots, so it is fairly drought tolerant. It adds nitrogen to the soil, which becomes available to the plants. It's good stuff. If you don't like having all those flowers, they now have the same species, but a cultivar called Pirouette, which is a microclover, and there are other microclovers. It's about a third the size in terms of leaves of regular white clover, so it has a much finer texture, and it doesn't bloom very much at all. so it looks more lawny, and you don't have to worry about bees stinging the people running over your lawn. It wears well also. One of the things, when you talk about supplementing your lawn or getting away from full grass for your lawn, you need to think about what you're trying to get out of the lawn. If what you're after is a relatively flat green area to look at, your choices are huge. But if you also want something that you can picnic on and walk barefoot on, you need something that will tolerate that wear. All of the things on this page and the next two will do that. None of them are natives. Some of them are considered invasive, which is kind of what we're after in a lawn, but they'll get the job done. Blue star creeper is one of those pretty close to invasive things. It's not going to leak. It's not going to run across the countryside like purple loosestrife taking over. But what it is going to do is move across your lawn like lava, and anything in its path will get covered by either the blue star creeper or the green carpet rupture wort. They just grow and grow. They're kind of pretty. They're drought tolerant. They don't need much mowing. They look okay, and you can walk on them. Elf and thyme is actually a kind of a nice thing to do, including on a steep slope where it's really not safe to mow so much, because it stays low, it always looks tidy, and it has flowers that the bees love. And if you do end up walking on it, it will smell really good when you do that. It's not that hard to establish. If you want something that looks even more intriguing, you can put down all different kinds of thyme on the slope, because they all stay really low and they all kind of like the same area, the same growing environment. There are mixes that you can add to lawns that will bloom, or that will smell really good, or that will something or other. If you go that way, you should read the box very carefully for the zone information to make sure that they're hardy here. The picture that this came from is a California company, and this fleur de lawn is hardy here, but they make quite a few mixes that are not. So read the small print. Sedum sod is an intriguing idea for hell strips. And a hell strip is that narrow strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street that is hot, dry, trodden on, and just a miserable place for anything to grow. And then you need to wrestle your mow over there and mow it anyway. You can put down sedum sod, which is an interesting variety of all kinds of different sedums, and they will love that area and they will spread into it. It will look interesting. It won't grow so high that you can still open your car door over it. So it's a thought. In part shade, here are two things that people have tried very hard to eliminate from their lawns, but welcome them instead and your life will be easier. Creeping Charlie is also known as ground ivy. When you mow it, it smells good. The bees like it. It can take foot traffic. Very invasive. You probably already have it, and if you don't, a friend of yours does. That's the easiest way to get it. It is in the mint family. And ajuga, bugle, comes in many different colors. It does have flower spikes, but if you don't want them, you can mow them down. And it's low, flat, and dense, which is kind of what you're looking for. If you have even more shade, consider moss. Without knowing hardly anything about moss, there are two kinds of moss in the world. There is the kind that when you walk on it, it just peels off the soil. And there is the kind that you cannot pull up. It is that firmly rooted. I would go for the second one, and it's the moss that you see in the background. They look like teeny little pine trees. It's beautiful stuff. You feel that in summer and you just want to be a toad and nestle down in that soft greenness and live there. And it's not hard to start in your environment. You grab some of that from somewhere, you put it in your blender with buttermilk and you pour it on your soil and it will grow if it's moist and dark, which are things that your grass hates. So I would definitely recommend mosses for areas where you want a beautiful green cover and you're just not going to grow grass. Mowing. If you have to mow, you set your mower height to 2.5 to 3 inches. If you mow it much lower, what's going to happen is the sun is going to shine on the soil, warm up the soil, and make it a nicer environment for all those weeds to grow in. Cool soil is the friend of the grasses that you want to grow. Don't take off, and if you let it go much higher, it's going to flop over. Don't remove more than 1/3 of the blade because you're chopping off 1/3 of a plant. Don't mow when the lawn is wet because it will make the grass clump. Plus what you're doing is cutting a whole bunch of blades, and the wound, if the grass is wet, is immediately open to fungal disease. Keep the blade really sharp so you're actually cutting it and not tearing it. Use a mulching mower so that you're not removing the nutrients from the soil. If possible, which it almost never is, cut at right angles each time you mow. And the real reason for that has to do with soil compaction. We tend to almost wear ruts in our lawn by always mowing in the same direction. And if we can vary it a bit, it'll give the ground itself time to recover. Watering. I say watering, and the first thing I say is don't use too much nitrogen, but don't use too much nitrogen. When you use a lot of nitrogen, it promotes growth of the blade of the plant at the cost of root growth. What you want is substantial root growth because that's what's going to get you through the droughts. The larger the expanse of the grass roots, the more access to water it has and the tougher it is. Consider letting it go dormant in summer, but if you don't want to, monitor the water. If you haven't gotten an inch, then water early in the morning because you want to minimize the amount of time that the blades stay wet in order to decrease the opportunity for fungal growth. And you want to minimize the amount of water that gets wasted by just evaporating, which would happen if you watered in the middle of the day. When you walk across your lawn and you can look back and see the footprints, the lawn needs watering or could use watering. That's mild drought stress. Until then, don't water. You don't need to water on a schedule because so much of it is going to depend on how hot it is and how windy it is and how cloudy it is and all of that. And then you water to recharge the root zone. If you actually know whether you're sandy or loamy or clayey, you can understand better how much water to put down, but not understanding that an inch is close enough for government work. And the way you tell that you've put down an inch is you put out a cat food can, an empty cat food can or an empty tuna can or something like that in the watering zone, and you time how long it takes for that can to fill. That's about how long it takes to put down an inch of water. Fertilizing. Nitrogen helps the blades of the grass grow. It gives it that dark green color. If you put down too much nitrogen, then you're going to have more blade than root, which will reduce the general vigor. And the excess nitrogen will wash away. It is very mobile in the soil and potentially add to pollution in streams. The right amount of phosphorus is good for root growth and winter hardiness, but too much can affect the plant's ability to absorb nutrients. Most plants absorb nutrients proportionate to how much they're out there. So if everything out there is phosphorus, the plant's just going to be able to get in phosphorus. If what's out there is the right amount of phosphorus, then the plant will also be able to get nitrogen and potassium and copper and all of the other things it needs. Excessive phosphorus can also wash away and pollute our streams and rivers. And it's a waste of money if you want to look at it that way. Potassium seems like it's just wear tolerance, toughness, general growth. And excessive potassium is not a hazard. It is not mobile in the soil, but it's a waste of money. The best low maintenance practice is to fertilize once around Labor Day, 1 to 2 pounds per 100,000 square feet of nitrogen, and then the rest as indicated in the soil test. A quote I really like is that an uninformed approach to soil and nutrient management is neither economically viable nor environmentally responsible. A short way of saying that is, if you just throw chemicals at it, you're wasting your money and you're messing up the environment. Weeds. A few weeds isn't a terrible thing. So one way of dealing with weeds is to tolerate them. You can pull up the ones that really annoy you. The only thing we used to pull up out of lawns is thistles because it hurt when we stepped on them in our bare feet. If you want to go further than that, understand whether the weed you're trying to get rid of is an annual or a perennial. Lawn annuals start from seed every spring. So a pre-emergent crabgrass killer will stop them. It gets applied about the time the forsythia bloom. It will also prevent other seeds from germinating. So you can't start your lawn, and if you start your lawn and put down pre-emergent, you will have wasted your time. Broadleaf killer is against perennial weeds, and it's a better thing to do if you need to kill these things, to spot treat rather than blanket treat. Do understand what it is you're trying to kill and make sure that that pesticide works against that weed. Follow the label. The label is the law, and the label is not just that thing you see on the back. You have to open it up and read the whole thing. Note that broadleaf killers will kill all dicots, which means most of your garden plants. So if you spread it too widely, you may do in your perennial border. One year, the master gardeners were called in to diagnose a whole bunch of dead, fairly newly planted shrubs that somebody had planted around their lawn. And when you scan back and look, every other one was dead. And what had happened is the guy loaded up weed and feed in a whirly spreader, ran down the lawn and spread it on the lawn, but also on the shrub at the end of that row. Turned around, missed the next shrub, came back, turned around, came back, and spread it on the lawn, but also the third shrub in the line. So basically, by putting this poison on every third shrub, he managed to kill half of them. It's poison. Insects. If there are a few bugs in your lawn, it's okay. One of the things that integrated pest management tells you is how many beetles you have to have before you do something about it. One isn't the right answer. It's something like 7 or 14 per square foot. You can look it up. Below that threshold, give nature a chance. It might fix it on its own. If you need to use a chemical, use a chemical targeted at that specific bug, not the kill everything and let nature sort it out. You have to, if you do the kill everything poison, you may be doing your lawn more damage than help because you will be killing a lot of your allies as well. Again, read the label. The label is the law. Manage disease. Most of the diseases will deal with themselves if you just give them a few minutes. The weather will improve, and usually the reports of this fungicide really helped my lawn were the weather changed and it cured itself. You should also know that fungicides have been implicated in bee die-off. So if you've been avoiding using insecticides and even herbicides out of respect for the pollinators, fungicides too, sorry. If you are a hive dweller, there are good funguses that you use that help you out in the hive, and fungicides will take those out too. This is a rerun. This is where a great deal of this information came from. Are there any questions? You're muted, Catherine.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to group some of them so they're kind of on the same topic.
Sure.
We had 3 questions about different kinds of grasses. And one was just some products mentioned. Are you familiar with Pearl's premium grass? Another question about zoysia grass. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Not hardy here. Zoysia is, I think zoysia is a Texas type grass. I don't think it's hardy up here.
And another question about creeping red fescue. Is that drought tolerant?
Yep. All of these grasses, with the exception of Kentucky bluegrass, are drought tolerant if grown correctly, which is to say, when they're irrigated, make the whole root zone get wet, or don't irrigate them at all past when you start the seed. When you start the seed, unless you're extraordinarily lucky in terms of weather, you are going to have to water. But once established, the others will do just fine without irrigation.
And were you at all familiar with Pearl's premium grass?
Flip the box over, read the back, and see what it says.
Okay, a couple questions about sedums. Is sedum sod good for the edge of the lawn near your asphalt driveway?
Oh yeah, it's fine. The thing with sedum sod is that it is not as wear tolerant as mulch. So if you always get out of your car at exactly the same spot, you might consider doing something dead there. But if you get out at different spots or cut across it at different spots, sedum sod will do great there. It almost can't get too hot for it.
And the other question was, can you walk on a sedum sod?
You can, but you can't play football on it. I mean, it'll tear up. So you can walk across it. You can sit on it and have a picnic. But one of the cool things about grass, and actually that one kind of moss, is that if you run fast, if a dog runs, it's digging in with its claws, and that tends to pull up plants that are loosely attached to the ground. Sedum sod tends to be slightly loosely attached because one of the ways that it reproduces is by little bits of it breaking off and rerooting somewhere else.
Okay, we have about 3 questions on mosses. Does a moss lawn require more acidic soil?
It depends on the moss, and it's a mix. So I don't think any of the mosses that grow in the Northeast would like it over 7. You can absolutely grow moss at 6.5, and you can absolutely grow moss at 5.5. So you probably, if you haven't, unless you have overlimed your soil, you can grow moss.
And okay, we also have kind of the opposite question. Why do I have moss in my grass?
The 2 the three most likely reasons are all the same, which is the moss is better at growing there than the grass is. It's outcompeting the grass. And that might be because the ground is compacted. Moss has a very different root structure. It might be because the soil is very acidic. Moss is much more tolerant of acidic soil than grass. It might be because it's really shady. Moss needs much less light to grow than grass.
We've also have a request that you repeat the moss recipe for transplanting.
So
moss.
look online because there's a bunch of them, but what it amounts to is get a bunch of the moss, just dig up a clot of it, throw it in a blender with buttermilk, pulse a few times, and pour it out where you want the stuff to grow. The actual sporing body on some of these mosses is tapped onto the tip of the thing. So that's one way of making it grow, but also it's not a vascular plant. So it's just a really cool critter.
We have a couple questions about amendments. Is diatomaceous earth okay for slugs, or does it kill other good things? And maybe what is diatomaceous earth?
Diatomaceous earth is earth made out of diatoms, and diatoms are ancient teeny little creatures that had enough of a shell that when they died and thousands of years passed, it left this stuff that feels like sharp chalk. And the idea is that when a slug walks over this stuff, it feels bad. It makes teeny little slits in his little slimy belly, and he doesn't like it. And therefore it can protect the plant that you have it scattered around. Nothing is perfect. So diatomaceous earth probably does offend somebody's sensibilities that we like, but the vast majority of good bugs aren't going to be bothered by it a bit as long as it's on the soil. One of the things that we tend to do with these soil products like that and kaolin and all of that is we sprinkle them on the plant itself. And at that point, some of the teenier bugs may get their mouth parts clogged up. Even if they're strictly predatory, you need to think a little bit about the pros and cons. But for the most part, earth is inert, so at least what you're doing is mechanical, not chemical.
Another amendment question: is milky spore still useful for controlling grubs?
Probably. So as the big debate about milky spore was twofold. One is humans are impatient and you didn't see instant results, so people assumed it wasn't working. The second thing is milky spore is, I think, a bacteria or a fungus, I never can remember, and it was marginally hardy up here. Well, good news, everything's getting warmer. So they now think milky spore is probably hardy up here. If applied correctly, which means periodically for something like 3 years, it can infect your soil and do a nice number against the grubs. One question I have, I don't know the answer to, is if you actually manage to eradicate grubs from your lawn, does the milky spore then sort of give up and go away? And do you need to keep inoculating after you've done the initial decimation of the grubs, or does a minimal population, which you're still going to get, is that adequate to keep the milky spore alive? And if Joel or Catherine or anybody else knows the answer to that, pitch in. Okay.
Oh, I think you're
It's
expert on this one, Gretel.
it's certainly better than a lot of the other choices. One of the things, if you do nothing and your lawn isn't already wildly infected, what will happen is crows, robins, and skunks will help you out. They'll go eat the things themselves, and you'll see damage to your lawn in late, sort of in maybe early June, which is when the big fat grubs come near the surface to pupate.
Let's see. I have a few more questions here. Do we have to wait to do all the seeding until Labor Day, or can we do it in the spring or some other time?
You can do it in the spring. If you do it in Labor Day, you will not have to live through crabgrass competing with your baby seed. But if you do it now, or as soon as the ground is workable, you will have a solid month where your grass seed has an advantage over the crabgrass. It's worth a shot. If you seed now, you can't really use pre-emergent crabgrass killer. So if you just had a thin lawn, but it was pretty good beside that, go for it. Why not? If you're willing to do the crabgrass by hand, it's not that hard, go for it. It's purely a competition thing.
Another question about seeding in the spring. What do we do with bare spots in the spring? Should we give them time to correct themselves or reseed?
I would try to remember, but odds are if everything else is greening up and that thing still looks bare, it's bare. And I would go buy a box of whatever. And even if, so when you do a patch, you aren't digging into the soil and pulling out roots. You're scratching the surface like this, which kind of feels good, and sprinkling a little bit of seed on top and patting it down. So even if it turns out there is some grass that lives there, you haven't really done it any harm.